it into emuelec. It's going to start with this intro video here. I'm just going to speed through it for you. And then here you are. This is the interface here. You basically just scroll through your systems and then pick your games. Now this is just one of many skins that are available for this device. If you press start and then go into UI settings, you can see there's another skin available under the theme set. Let's pick this crystal one and check it out. And this is what the crystal one looks like. And real quick here, I'm just going to shuffle through all the different systems on this device. In general, this is going to play all the systems that are supported in emuelec. Basically, it's going to cap out at Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and Sony PSP. But as you can see, it's been loaded with a ton of different systems and games. All told, there's about 50,000 games on the 256GB SD card. Way more than you'd ever be able to play in a lifetime. Now once you're connected to your Wi-Fi, you can go into the update section and download new themes. And there's something like a dozen or so themes that you can pick from. My favorite is this one here. It's called emuelec. Now say you come upon a system that you don't actually want to show in the menu. What you do is you go into the game collection settings section, and then select systems displayed, and then just uncheck the systems you don't want to see in the menu. Super easy. Then emuelec will restart itself, and there you go, it's no longer there. A couple other things I would recommend you do before you get started is go into the emuelec settings, and then turn off the always show boot video. That's going to turn off the video that appears every time you start up the system. Okay, another thing I recommend you do is go into the game setting, and then under smooth games, turn that one to off. This is going to turn off bilinear filtering and make your games look a little bit sharper. Now you may actually see duplicates of games in the menu. Let's just pick a random game here. So I've never heard of this one here. It's called Super Mario Bros. 3, but you can see there's two versions of it. So let's start up one of them and see what they look like. Okay, so you can clearly see that this one's all messed up. They've misspelled everything. Instead of player 1, it says Jogador. What the heck is a Jogador? Anyway, obviously they made a huge mistake with this one, and I'm not sure why it's like this. For example, when you're actually playing the game, instead of saying World 1 at the bottom left, it says Mundo 1. Now if we check out the other Mario 3, and again, I don't know anything about this game, I've never even heard of it, but when you start it up, it does look like it's in the correct English. So obviously this is going to be the superior version. So once you figure that out, what you do is you go back into the menu, you hold down the A button, and then the options for that game are going to appear. And then you can delete that one that's in Portuguese. And there you go, now you only have one of that game. Now this system is so powerful that one of the things you could consider doing is adjusting the latency options within RetroArch. So for example, if you turn on some of these here, and then you start playing a game, it does improve the latency of the controller itself. But the thing is, even though it feels better when you're playing it, it actually looks worse as you're running around. And I don't know if you can notice it here on screen, but it just felt a little bit more jittery than normal. And it kind of started giving me a headache when I was running across with Mario. It just didn't look good to me. So this is a bit of a trade-off. You could play around with the latency settings. Because this CPU is so powerful, it's going to be able to handle all that. But honestly, I didn't like it. Now speaking of the fact that this is a very powerful CPU, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on 16-bit systems, but I do want to show off that Star Fox works perfectly on the Super Nintendo. And because this runs so well, it's just a given that every other Super Nintendo game is probably going to play just fine too. So in general, I'm not going to show really any 8-bit or 16-bit system. They're all on here and they play great, but let's move on to some of the harder stuff. So starting off first with a Nintendo 64, you can see it's running at about 60 frames per second using the native 480p resolution. But let's go into the quick menu options here and upscale it to 960 by 720. And just like that, you're going to get about 60 frames per second. In this game in particular, it does dip down to something around 58 frames per second, but honestly, if I didn't see the numbers at the top right, I wouldn't be able to detect any of that slowdown. As far as I could tell, every single Nintendo 64 game played at 720 resolution and at full speed. Even the harder ones like Mario Tennis or Cruisin' USA, they had no problem. Every once in a while, I would hear a little bit of a stutter in the audio, but when it came to gameplay, everything was just fine. And there's a potential here that you could probably upscale it to 1080p as well, and still get pretty good gameplay for most of these Nintendo 64 games. I mean, even GoldenEye 007 played at 720 resolution. And even though some of the frames per second did dip a lot, the gameplay itself was smooth the whole time. Now this game is notorious for having frame rate issues, so your mileage may vary, but it did look really good to me. Same thing with Conker's Bad Fur Day. I actually got further in this game than I ever had before, because this is legitimately the first time I've ever been able to play it at full speed.
Who's this guy?
Now another system I want to show off real quick for the Europeans in the audience. Amiga runs just great. You do have to mess with the options a little bit, but I would recommend checking out the guides from emuelec specific to Amiga on the Super Console X, and I'll leave a link to it in the video description below. Okay, so moving over to other systems, PS1 works just fine. You can actually upscale this resolution as well in the RetroArch quick menu. And in general, everything played at a solid 60 frames per second. There's no issue at all with any PS1 game. Even the harder to run games like Bloody Roar 2 were absolutely flawless. And I wasn't totally surprised by this because, the PS1 is one of the easier systems to emulate from this era, but it is still nice to see. Now Nintendo DS also works really well. You can also go into the settings and turn on high resolution for this as well, and it's not going to affect performance in any way. In general, you're going to get 100% performance of every Nintendo DS game. Your only limitation is going to be whether or not it requires touchscreen inputs. Okay, so moving on to arcade, in general, all of your classic arcade games are going to play just perfectly. Really, anything that can play through MAME for the most part is going to play well. That includes any of the shooters and fighters you can think of. The only one that I really had any issues with is Killer Instinct, which is notoriously hard to emulate. As you can see here, it got about 45 frames per second, so it's running at about 3/4 speed. To me, this is too slow to really enjoy, but the option's there if you really want it. And this game actually didn't come bundled with the system, I had to add it myself. I'll show you how to do that later in this video. But other than Killer Instinct and a couple others like NFL Blitz and Tekken, everything else played really well. CPS 3 games like Street Fighter 3 were perfect, and there's a big library of Neo Geo CD games on here. And then all the regular Neo Geo games played well also. I did experience some slowdown with the Metal Slug games, and I don't think it really had to do with frame rate. I think these games just bog down when there's lots of things on the screen. Okay, let's move over to Sega Saturn now. I found that there was a bunch of games bundled onto this system, and so I had an opportunity to play a lot of games that I really hadn't played before. Now, Sega Saturn actually plays so well that you can mess around with the scaling options. And this part of the video looks a little bit blurry. It has to do with my video capture card. It's not the actual gameplay itself. It looked really good when I was playing it on my monitor. Either way, these games played so well, I wanted to mess with the scaling options available in RetroArch. So going into the quick menu options, I changed the rendering to 2x rendering as you can see here. And it does look better, but it also has some weird wobbling with some of the 3D sprites. So I'm not really sure if I like that. I don't like how the trunk of the car is kind of wobbling a little bit. But honestly, you can scale it all the way up to 720p, and it does take a little bit of a hit in terms of speed, but if you really wanted to have nice looking Saturn, it is possible on this. Here's one more example with Panzer Dragoon. Here it is with native rendering, and I think it looks just fine. I think this is kind of what I expect when I look at a Saturn game. It's supposed to be chunky and blocky. It's a very early 3D system. But you can turn on 2x rendering, and it does look a lot nicer. I do think that 2x rendering is probably the best for Sega Saturn on this system. And like I mentioned, there are a ton of Saturn games on this one, at least on the 256GB card, and it's a lot of fun to go through this catalog. This is one of those systems I never got to try when I was growing up. Okay, so moving on to other systems, Atomic Wave, every game that I had on here played perfectly. I'm going to show off Dolphin Blue because that's one of the hardest to emulate. As you can see here, solid frame rate throughout the whole thing. Same thing with Sega Naomi games, they also had very good performance, even if you upscaled it to 720p. So let's move over to Sega Dreamcast and see how that works. And just like with the other Sega systems, this one runs beautifully too. In fact, you can upscale this to 720p, and in general, it's going to play perfectly. And this also comes bundled with games I'd never tried before. For example, Metropolis Street Racer, which I was very disappointed to find out does not have Superman in it at all. Why would they do that? They're in Metropolis, where's Superman? But all the other usual suspects played just fine. Crazy Taxi 2 would have frame rate dips every once in a while, but it felt like the performance was smooth throughout the whole thing. Other games like Ikaruga are just fine. And probably one of the ultimate tests is Virtua Fighter 3 TB, and as you can see here, it's also playing really well, even upscaled at 720p. Okay, so last note on Dreamcast is Sonic Adventure 2. This one also plays just fine, upscaled to 720p, but in RetroArch you can actually go into the options and turn on widescreen hacks as well. And Sonic Adventure 2 is one of those games that looks really good in widescreen. Now while this works really well for probably 90% of the gameplay, you will find that there are moments where it bottlenecks into much slower speeds. So as you can see here, when you're going down the stairs, it slows down to a crawl. There's a moment where it runs at maybe half speed, and then it bounces right back to normal speed. And so it's one of those things where you kind of have to play it by ear, whether or not the widescreen is going to be worth this trade-off. Either way, the options are there. Now back in the main menu, if you go into Game Settings, and then per System Advanced Configuration, you can specify which emulator you want to run for every system on this device. And this is mostly important for the Sony PSP, because by default they have the RetroArch core selected, but the standalone port of PPSSPP runs much better, so you need to change that over before you start playing PSP. Now in order to get to the settings in the standalone emulator, you actually need a USB keyboard the first time around, and what you need to do is you need to press the escape key. And that'll bring up the menu settings, and then you can go in and change the controls, and then map a key to the pause function here. This is going to allow you to get back to the settings without having to use a USB keyboard every time. Okay, let's check out gameplay now. In general, what I tend to do is I turn on 2x rendering and then an auto frame skip of 1 for every PSP game. And what that's going to do is it's going to run it at full speed if possible, but it will initiate an auto frame skip if it's having any sort of slowdown issues. What that means is you're going to have relatively smooth gameplay throughout, but you may get a little bit of jerkiness depending on the game. But for the most part, even with 2x rendering, it rarely would dip into any sort of frame skip. What that says to me is you could probably get away with 3x rendering on certain games. But in general, I do think that a 2x rendering looks really good on a TV or a monitor. And many games that I figured were going to have a lot of slowdown were still playing perfectly with 2x rendering. For example, LEGO Star Wars 2 is really hard to emulate at this specific part, and it played it perfectly. Same thing with Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier, this one plays really well too. Now there are some graphical glitches. For example, with this ATV game, you can see that the character sprite is all weird looking. But otherwise it plays great. And of course, the only games that don't play well are the God of War games. With a 2x rendering and auto frame skip of 1, they just don't work really well. You can tell there's a lot of slowdown. But if you bump that down to 1x rendering, it does play fairly well. The auto frame skip is really coming into play here, but if you really wanted to play this game, despite having this low resolution, you could definitely do it. Now, a bunch of PSP games are actually not bundled with this system. For example, the God of War games, as well as Ridge Racer, aren't on there. And that's a shame because Ridge Racer in particular runs really well on this. So let me show you how to remove and add games from the SD card. And honestly, it's super easy because with emuelec 4.0 and above, it actually has its own SD card partition, so all you have to do is plug the SD card in and you can find all of the games. Now, for example, I noticed that the Nintendo DS has a ton of duplicates. If you just search for the word Japan within the DS folder, you're going to find thousands of files that are Japanese localized games. There's nearly 14 gigs of Japanese language games on this SD card. And personally, I don't ever plan on playing a Japanese DS game on this device, so I just deleted all 14 gigs right then and there. That gives me more space to add new games. And with that additional storage space, now you can add in your own games. You can see here I'm dragging over a bunch of PSP games. And that's basically it.